Okay, St. Francis de Sales. Um, in this last time together, we're actually going to be looking at, I'm going to actually, let's see. Okay, we're actually going to be looking at the spiritual friendship of St. Francis de Sales and Jane Frances de Chantal. And in a special way, we're going to be looking at the way St. Francis de Sales talks about soothing sorrows and how do we live through the sorrows in our life. So a little bit of background about Jane. Jane was living at her father-in-law's estate after her husband had died when she actually met Francis de Sales. During a Lenten season, she went to hear a series of sermons by him. And in that moment, they kind of both came to recognize that God was pulling them together. Now, Jane Frances de Chantal was in herself a very beautiful woman. She was married to the Baron Christophe de Rabutin Chantal, and it was a happy marriage, but he was unfaithful to her. And so she reared and educated her own children, but she also reared and educated the daughter that was born out of wedlock to her husband, and her name is Claudine. And that's a beautiful gesture of love that she showed in her young years. And a friend, when Christophe and a friend were out hunting, the friend's gun strap got caught in a branch, and the weapon went off, and that some of the shrapnel hit Christophe. And for 9 days, he prepared himself and his wife for his death, and really asked that she never speak against this friend who had been the cause of his death. But obviously, when he died, she was inconsolable and mourned this death for many, many years. But she began to sense during this period of mourning, like this desire for something that was much deeper than even her love for Christophe. You know, he had died, and it was like all the jigsaw pieces of the puzzle of her life had been thrown up in the air and fallen all over the place. And she had no way on her own to get them back together again. However, in her meeting with Francis de Sales, she found a kindred spirit and someone who actually would help her put the pieces back together again. And she actually had a spiritual director before him. And that director really was trying to get her to rigidly follow certain things, certain ways of praying, certain ways of acting. And it was actually cramping her spirit, almost killing her spiritually. And so when she heard Francis de Sales in his sermons, and when she met him and began to speak with him, she found someone that kind of set her free, someone in whose gentleness and openness of spirit was able to really help her to grow and to blossom in the way in which God was leading her. So this meeting between Francis and Jane was the beginning of a very long spiritual friendship that lasted 20 years. And it began, of course, when she still had children. She was still a mother to her children who were very young. And, but you know, she was like on with it, ready to move on, not from her family, but to move on to spiritual heights. And he kind of like put the damper on that. And he really helped her to learn how to stay right where she was. And, you know, that's really kind of one of the secrets we can learn from Francis de Sales, is that when we want to get on with our life, he says, stay right where you are. And that really became the bedrock of her life and her prayer. I remember one story where she wanted to go to the Carmelites. She told him she was going to talk to the Carmelite superior and learn how to meditate from her. And he was not too happy with all of that because he really wanted her to go through a gentle and free and open way of being with God that wasn't rigidly a method that she had to follow that would cramp her spirit. The other amazing thing that she had to deal with, obviously, was her anger at the death of her husband and her anger toward that friend. And I think what Francis de Sales told her is really a key lesson for what we're going to be looking at in his quotes. For he knew her struggles because she told him everything. But he instructed her this, like, don't seek out that man. But if he does come to you, receive him with a compassionate and gracious heart. And she said, your blood might boil and you might feel agitated and uneasy, but your emotions just prove that you're a human being. And he says what counts is the decision of your will to treat the man with gentleness. And through this experience, St. Francis de Sales wanted to teach her a major lesson to discover that she was capable of loving all things, even the death of her husband, through the power of Jesus Christ. She learned to love all that life presented to her and to be compassionate beyond her present capacity and to embrace all crosses. So Francis and Jane spent 20 years, which spanned that very beginning of her relationship with him and her relationship with God, in a sense. And it moved all the way through the founding of the order, the Visitation Sisters. And really, by the time she died, there was 80 monasteries that had been founded of Visitation Sisters, of which she was the mother. So she went from a very contemplative life to a very busy life, making the contemplative life possible for so many others. And I think Francis was truly prophetic when he said to her, when he first met her, I think that God gave me to you. Every hour makes me more sure of it. That is all I can say. Commend me to your guardian angel. So Francis gave her a rule of life, a way to live from the very beginning that was gentle, because he said, and if you can't fulfill all of it, don't worry. Don't worry. So characteristic of Francis, he impressed on her that everything has to be done through love and not by force. This liberty of the spirit is the way we have to operate entirely. And then he also told her that she could learn patience. And he said, be patient until you get the wings of a dove, and then you can fly. There's a senior sister in our community who for years has been telling me, pray to God that I will become patient. Pray to God that I will become patient. And but these words are very, very tender almost. Be patient until you get the wings of a dove, and then you will fly. And as we know, Jane Frances de Chantal did fly. And St. Francis de Sales, in directing the Visitation Sisters, left us a wealth of spiritual writings, as we're looking at some of them, that are not severe, overly ascetical, complicated, but that are simple and present to God. So he was like, in her experience through her whole life, this goodness that surrounded her. And we'll see a quote later that he kind of uses that image for us. But he surrounded her with goodness and helped to draw out the goodness within her, to look at the beauty, the goodness, the love, the possibility of beauty that was hers. And with that, we'll move on to our first quote. And he says, "Courage, let us go forward and let us practice these lowly and common, yet solid, holy, and excellent virtues." So lowly virtues, common virtues, but they are solid, holy, and excellent. That's that saying that be patient until you acquire the wings of a dove. He didn't say be patient until you acquire the heights of an eagle. He always looked at the lowly and the common, the solid, grounding, foundational way of being. He says, abide in peace and keep yourself on your feet and on the side of heaven. So we're going to be looking at the way he looks at earth and heaven and how he's suggesting to us to deal with our living on earth, as in this picture, where many times things seem to be falling apart or to not be alive, and yet we are alive in the midst of the, quote, rubble of a situation. He says, God has held you with his goodness in your affliction, just like Francis held Jane with goodness in her affliction. And as we can truly hold others with goodness in their affliction, he will assuredly always do so. My God, says St. Gregory to an afflicted bishop, how can it be that our hearts, which are already in heaven, are agitated by the accidents of the earth? I think this is kind of telling. He didn't say, how can it be that our hearts, which one day will be in heaven, are agitated by the accidents of the earth in our present life? He said, our hearts are already in heaven. Our hearts are already in heaven. Our scripture passage that we're going to be praying with today is going to be the Transfiguration. So when they looked at Jesus full of light, the light of God's presence and glory, our hearts are already in heaven. We already are transformed like Jesus, even now, here on earth. We are living in heaven. The mere sight, this continues the bishop, how can it be that our hearts are agitated by the accidents of the earth? The mere sight of our dear crucified Jesus can soften in a moment all our sorrows, which are only flowers in comparison with those thorns. Of course, they don't seem like flowers to us. And Jesus doesn't expect us to think they're flowers either. Many times we are in the agony in the garden in very real ways, begging that this cup may be taken from us or others we love. Then our great meeting point is in that eternity, the reward we have in view. How can anything affect us which is terminated by time? So, keeping things in perspective is really one of the most daunting and difficult interior tasks that we have. Going back, we're looking at this flower, and maybe if we had the entire picture, the flower is just one little speck in the midst of miles of these wood chips. And how can that little flower keep things in perspective? When we read the news, things seem to be spinning out of control. Terrorist attacks, natural disasters in, I think it's in India, or Bangladesh, and in Sierra Leone. All of these things costing people's lives and peace. How do we find courage in the midst of that chaos? And then there are our own personal tragedies, illness, loss of work or housing, financial disasters, our fear of aging. I just read a big list of things that really affect us right now. And I just want to stop here and ask you to go within yourself and to ask yourself, what do I feel? What am I feeling right now as I allow myself to be aware of these situations? What is in my heart? What within me wants to be heard? Maybe I'm feeling fear or discouragement or loneliness. And if I stay with it, I might realize how powerful it is. How do we switch from this to this courage that Francis de Sales is talking about? And I think we have to keep on going back to what we heard about his life at the beginning of this time together. The gentleness, the liberty of spirit, the sense it's okay if we can't do it, if we can't do it right now. The courage that he called Jane Frances de Chantal to, not the courage of a soldier, like go out and go to his address, look him up and tell him you forgive him, but the courage that even though your blood is boiling, and even though you're in pain, and even though you're agitated and worried and afraid, if he comes to you to, with your will, intentionally treat him with generosity, that's that courage that also takes into account our own agony. Sometimes, we think, so what am I supposed to do? In the face of all these things we read in the newspaper in our country, what should I be doing? What can I do about the weather around the world? How can I eradicate wildfires? How can I fix climate change? Me personally, we can't. And but maybe the question doing isn't really the right question. He didn't really give Jane something to do. He invited her to love. He invited her to be generous and to discover that she really had it in her to have this really profound and deep love. So he's asking us to keep things in perspective. Last week, we read a psalm whose message was, yes, the world is unfair and life here is difficult, but it will not always be so. And that's what St. Gregory is saying to the bishop here. Our hearts are already in heaven. Our lives we're already filled with God. And how can we be agitated by the accidents of the earth? And I think it's kind of like a balancing act, because, you don't hear in homilies often, you are already in heaven. You are filled with God. You are surrounded with the goodness of God. You are good. You are blessed. You are graced. We don't hear those things. We don't say them to ourselves. We don't hear them from friends. We don't have a deep understanding of the gifts that our baptism gives us. And so it's easy to then be lost in the wood chips and the wood piles of our life. But really, heaven is our true country, our true home. But now it is. We are a people in exile. We're exiled from the Garden of Eden with original sin. We wandered around the known earth. We wandered around in circles in the desert, in the Exodus. We even go around in circles ourselves now, looking for what we had lost. And if we look at the Hebrew Bible, the first thing we see is that the Israelites had more than their fair share of natural and unnatural disasters. Imagine for a moment, just one example. Imagine you've been living in your village, making a living, raising a family, and then the government of Egypt changes, a new pharaoh rises to power. Suddenly, soldiers break into your house in the night when you're sleeping and drag you and your family away. You will never see your home again. You will never see your family again. You're put in chains at your neck and your wrists and your ankles, and you're forced to do hard labor for the rest of your life. Bitterness and despair is no stranger to God's people. And then Jesus came, and Jesus coming is what changed everything. Sorrow is no stranger to Jesus, but his living it, his choosing it, his desiring to become human like us, to show us that even in the wood chips of our life, there is a flower within us, that God, the Almighty God who created heaven and earth, desired to come and live inside of us. I was thinking the other morning how, when you look at the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus, God is like, go here, I'll be with you. I'm this fire before you. I'm standing behind you to protect you. Sending the prophets, blah, 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 blah. When Jesus came, he didn't want to stay outside us anymore. He came inside of us. With the Last Supper, he gave us the bread of life so that God wouldn't be outside of us anymore. He would be inside us. And that's a secret Francis de Sales knew, is that if we are gentle, if we are patient, if we can stay with what's inside of us, we will begin to see that it flowers. The Eucharist flowers into a beautiful, beautiful bush, a beautiful bush of virtues, a beautiful sunrise, a radiance. And it comes from Jesus. So I know I'm probably half Pelagian because I'm always running around saying, what do I need to do? And what do I need to do to fix this and change that and become a better person? But it's all really about, what do I need to do in order to allow Jesus inside of me to truly be life, be my life, and be the life of others through me? So C.S. Lewis said, I think earth, if it is chosen instead of heaven, will turn out to have been all along only a region in hell. And earth, if put second to heaven, to have been from the beginning a part of heaven itself. I'm not even sure about that quote, but anyway, but I think what it's, I get it. Okay, it is true. Okay, so if we're choosing earth instead of heaven, if we're only seeing earth and forgetting this beautiful heaven that is inside of us. You know, Elizabeth is a Trinity. Jesus, God is heaven in our souls. Our life does feel like hell. But if earth is put second to heaven and heaven is where everything is within us, then this earth will be the beginning of heaven. So St. Francis de Sales is talking about keeping our fears and insecurities, our sorrows and our grief, our inability to understand and to act in perspective. He doesn't say don't feel them, but he's trying to say they're not all that is. This is the second quote, and he says, "It is a good practice of humility never to look upon the actions of our neighbors, except to remark the virtues that are in them, but never their imperfections. For so long as we are not in charge of others, we must never turn our eyes, and still less our attention, to their imperfections." We must always put the best judgment that we can upon what we see our neighbor do. In doubtful matters, we ought to persuade ourselves that what we notice is not bad, but that it is our own imperfections that cause such a thought to arise in our minds. In this way, rash judgments, which are very dangerous evils, and for which we ought to have a sovereign detestation, are avoided. In cases in which we see another do something that is clearly wrong, we ought to have compassion for our neighbor and humble ourselves for these defects as if they were our own, begging God for the other's amendment with the same heart we would for our own, were we subject to the same defects. I don't know about you, but when I first read this, I was like, okay. We all know that this is the way to be, but when the rubber hits the road, you know, our blood boils and everything happens inside of us. And I've been reading this book by Father Arseny. Father Arseny was I think he's Russian Orthodox, and he was one in one of the brutal special sectors of the Soviet prison camp system in World War II and beyond. And I'm reading it in the evenings, and I came upon this. All the chapters are written by people who saw him, knew him, heard stories about him, experienced him in the prison and beyond. And I just want to read you this example and then talk about it. Okay, so there were certain people in the system who were criminals, and there are other people in the system who were political prisoners. The criminals were still criminals, and they were still trying to beat people up, and they still ran the show. Everybody was afraid of them, even in the Soviet prison, and even the people who were in charge of the prison. So one of these fellows comes up and says, I forgot what they're talking about. Oh, they're talking about the party members. They destroyed churches, they trampled the faith. At this point, someone noticed Father Arseny sitting nearby, and he said, "Well, tell us how the church looks on the authorities that did all this to the church." And he remained silent, but they pulled him physically into the arguing circle, and they made him answer. So he stopped for a moment, and then he said, "You are having a heated argument. It has turned sour, even fierce. It is truly difficult to live in the camp, and we all know hell will end for us. Death. They were all there assuming they were going to die. That is why the argument has become so bitter. It is understandable. Only no one should be destroyed or killed. All of you are blaming the authorities, the orders, the people. You have pulled me in to draw me into one side and irritate the other. You say that the communists have arrested the believers, closed the churches, and trampled on the faith. Yes, it does look that way on the surface, but let us look into this more deeply. Let us glance at the past. Among us Russian people, many have lost the faith, lost respect for our past. We lost much of what was precious and good. Who is at fault? The authorities? No, we are at fault ourselves. We are only reaping what we ourselves have sown. Let us remember the bad examples set by the intelligentsia, the nobility, the merchants, and the civil servants. We in the priesthood were the worst of them all. Children of priests became atheists and revolutionaries simply because they had seen in their families lies and a lack of true faith. Long before the revolution, priests had already lost the real right to be the shepherds of their people. From among all the monasteries of our land, only 5 or 6 were real beacons of Christianity. What could the people learn from these monasteries? What kind of an example was set? We did not raise our people right. We did not give them the basis of strong faith. Remember all this. Remember, that is why the people were so quick to forget all of us, their own priests. They mainly forgot their faith and participated in the destruction of churches, sometimes even leading the way in their destruction. But I will tell you in all sincerity, whatever happens in my country, I am its citizen. As a priest, I always told my spiritual children that it is our responsibility to defend and support our fatherland. What is happening now must end. It is a huge mistake that will sooner or later be corrected. When you hear a saint talk out of this sense of being able himself to look at the broader picture and himself to take, in a sense, responsibility on the part of the priests for the situation of faith that the country was in, you can kind of understand what Francis is saying here. He's not saying, okay, I have to sit here and tell myself the opposite of what I actually see in front of my eyes. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you can get to a point in this gentleness, in this compassion, and in this love where you're able to see everything around you with different eyes. You still see things that are clearly wrong, or things that you're not sure exactly if they're wrong. But you can still have compassion in the same way that you would want to have others and God to have compassion on you. So this could seem like St. Francis is saying, don't judge others. And yet, in any world, but as we look out on the world today in our families and in our country, we are adults and we are at a change point in history. And we have to be able to say what is going on and to try to make sense of it. And as people of faith, we can step back and say, but have we, as Catholics, have we been all that we should have been in the American culture? Or are we also at fault for the state our country is in? My nephew, my oldest nephew, my godchild, was living with his girlfriend, joined the Anglican Church, was married in the Anglican Church. Thank goodness he was married. And but I remember his mom calling me in tears, my sister, and all I could say was, in some way we failed him, because he's living in an era that is looking for the way the church and the faith is there for the poor, is there for, all these different groups of people, the love, they cannot understand, but also neither can we really explain. And we're all kind of caught in this kind of vortex of change that's happening so fast. The whole rise of this neo-Nazi thing and everything that's going on with that around the country. It's a change that's happening so fast. We're all caught up in it. And it's like saying, can we step back personally and almost like humble myself for the sins of others, humble myself for all these other groups, and in compassion for them, begging that God will have compassion on us all. Humility is not a popular word this day, and we certainly don't see it or hear it a lot in the news. In fact, we often see people practicing the opposite. And the world rewards those who act in ways that are not good or right or moral. But we can remember that even though we are immersed in this earthly, confusing, frustrating, scary situation, we have heaven in our souls. We are representatives of heaven present right here in the world for others to see. And Francis de Sales says that we should wish like other people. Oh, and I think I need to go on here. And then he continues and he talks about acquiring the spirit of humility. And this is another thing. Oh, he says there is no other way but frequent repetition of acts of humility in order to acquire the spirit of humility. Humility makes us annihilate ourselves and all those things which are not necessary for our advancement in grace. So, good speaking, noble manners, great talents for management, a great eloquence, all of those things, he's saying to annihilate those things because they are not necessary for our salvation and sanctification. So not to put our trust in, our glory in these exterior things, but on top of them, to desire that others should have them. You may have seen and read the Litany of Humility. And it goes that others may be chosen and I set aside, that others may be consulted and that I be set aside. I pray that others may be loved and that I will be forgotten. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. It's like, it's a hard prayer to pray. I remember, it's such a simple, stupid thing, but there was one night, one of the sisters was leading an hour of prayer for a new professed sister. We were all there and she was praying out loud on and on and on and on and on. I was kind of agitated at her. And but really what I was agitated is that she was the center of attention and I was not. Ultimately, that's kind of what was going on. But for the first time, this very powerful surge, light, whatever, came over me, and like in tears that were painful but joyous. There was the first time I prayed part of the Litany of Humility, my own little version of it, with absolute desire that others would be chosen and centers of attention, and I would be set aside. But it was not, okay, I'm bad, I should be saying this and thinking this and desiring this. It was a grace from God. And, Francis de Sales, when he worked with Jane, that's what he helped her to see from the very beginning. He put her into this state, not of rigid doing things certain ways and getting somewhere, but in this space where she was open and ready and gentle and just moving on the speed that she could move with, trusting that God was leading her. And when you do that, at a certain point, something comes over you, something surprises you, something captivates you in a new way that maybe you said as a prayer for many, many years, but all of a sudden it's a grace. And I'm sure you've all experienced something like that in areas of your own life. So what is that? What's happening there? It's almost like there's a difference between the mind's filter, the monkey mind, and the mind's way of organizing reality and thinking about what's happening. Okay, so I should stop feeling the way I'm feeling, and I should start thinking this and blah, blah, blah. That's one level. And what Francis was continually drawing us down to was to see from the eyes of our soul. Not to see from the eyes of our being, our mind, but to see with the intellect, that inner, it's called the nous in Greek, but that inner total intuitive grasp of what is absolutely and ultimately true. And that immediate, oh my gosh, that immediately experience is what is different. So Father Arseny had that experience through many years of prayer and openness to God. And all of us are called to that cleansing of that inner eye of our soul by which we too can see what truly is. I remember the first time I very strongly felt it, which I'm sure you can resonate with from your own experience. It was after it had snowed, and I was driving to spiritual direction, and I was going down a country road all full of snow with trees. It was beautiful. And all of a sudden, it was just like, oh my God, you are so beautiful. I mean, it was the snow that I saw with my eyes, but something took over my spirit that made me see this is just a tiny speck of the beauty of God. And from that place, we are able to be humble and generous and loving. So he says, oh, how I wish that our hearts were as compact and as well sealed on all sides, so that if the troubles and tempests of the world seized them, they might never penetrate them. How I desire that there were no opening but on the side of heaven to breathe unto our Savior. And now listen to this image. This must be a bird. While the halcyons build their nests, and they build them on the surface of the water, and their young are still too tender to bear the dashing of the waves. God has care for them and pities them and keeps the sea from seizing the nests and carrying them away. And this is one of his moments. He says, oh God, in the same way, this sovereign goodness will secure the nests of our hearts for his holy love against all the assaults of the world, where he will defend us from being assailed. So that is a really profound image of God's love. And if you think back to Jane, that's kind of what Francis was for her. He kind of surrounded her, protected her, cared for her in the midst of the dashing of the waves, so that the waves didn't seize the nest and tear it apart. He protected it gently. And God does that for us. And we might have friends or directors who do that for us, or we might be called upon to do that for others. And I just love that image. A parent cannot keep the harsher realities of life from their child. They can't make sure their child is never hurt. But what they can do is ensure that their child is always loved, and that their child is always aware of that love. And that's the nest that St. Francis is speaking of here. We can't stop what we see in the country, but we can make sure that everyone in this country is loved by us. That in the midst of the hate, we intentionally are putting in not fear, but love. And it's that love that is going to get us through. God's love for us and the ways that we can reflect that love. Jacques Brel's song says, if we only have love, we can reach those in pain, we can heal all our wounds, we can use our own names. Love is, at the end of the day, the brightest reflection we have of that heavenly home that's within us and that we look forward to. Love is why it's there. It's why we're here. And it's our natural response to life. Love more, judge less. Love more, hate less. Love more, be less afraid. Love more, grow in humility. Love is a band-aid for all the scrapes and sprains of our life. It is how we confront evil, not by engaging with it, but by putting up a wall or a nest, to use St. Francis' image of love. It's all about love. So the image, the scripture image that I wanted to pray with tonight is the image of the Transfiguration. And I chose this image because it's a little different than we normally expect to see. And you don't see the apostles necessarily looking afraid. They're looking at the brightness of Jesus, and they're kind of taking it in. So I want to read the scriptures. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. And there he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. You know, when Mary sat at Jesus' feet at Bethany, Jesus kind of defended her. And Peter here is kind of saying something similar. It is good for us to be here. this amazing, over the top, wow, captivating experience that enables us not to see you, Jesus, with our eyes, our physical eyes, but to have woken up within our spirits that eye that truly knows you, who you are in your divinity, in your humanity, and who we are, who I am. In this radiance, we see one, what we will be when our physical bodies have this radiance. You know, when 100 years from now, when everybody in America is in eternity, except for the children, and we all of a sudden see each other from a very different perspective with this light in varying degrees, when we leave communion, we receive communion, and we are filled with that light, when we come more and more to recognize that we are Christ and that Christ lives in us, and that that light is the only thing that gets us through our life every day and will get us to our country. And our families and our country, they need to see people of light. You know, do they see enough people of light? You know, so I just love this, the story of the transfiguration. It's not just transformation, it's being transfigured, changed in a very profound way.